Welcome to another edition of the Big News Roundup. I'm Bill Thomas, and here's what's happening right now. Critics brutally mock Democrat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez after the presidential hopeful makes an absolute fool of herself at a prestigious international security gathering. The administration of Governor Tim Walz is under fire once again as a Minnesota state lawmaker is now raising concerns regarding her state's critical voter registration records. And a shocking new report reveals the shady scheme used by the former Biden administration in order to allow nearly 1 million illegal immigrants to remain in our country indefinitely. Also, rumors are picking up steam regarding the possible resignation of a prominent Supreme Court justice. And an Oscar-nominated heartthrob now seems likely to lose out on his dream role of James Bond simply because Lauren Sanchez Bezos, as in Jeff's wife, does not think he's right for the part. All this and a bunch more is coming up right now on the Big Roundup. We have a great deal to get to today, and we begin with this. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, better known as AOC or AOL, I think it's AOC, is now being raked over the coals by dozens of political pundits following a series of humiliating blunders at a high-profile meeting of world leaders and diplomats. During a number of public appearances at the recent Munich Security Conference in Germany, AOC repeatedly demonstrated time and again just how far away she is from actually being a viable leader for our country, while simultaneously looking like a complete numbskull throughout the entire process. Hey, look, this meeting was supposed to be for grown-ups. Why was she even there? In what one critic compares to an absolute train wreck, the Congresswoman appeared on a couple of panels in which she fumbled repeatedly through her unintelligible answers by trying desperately to connect the dots between income inequality, social instability, and authoritarianism. Well, at least she squeezed in some big words with a whole bunch of syllables. And in my mind, I think that sort of kind of counts for something. Now, dozens of her harshest critics are now weighing in on her dog and pony show, and they're widely panning her so-called performance. After listening to some of her nonsensical answers, among other things, they're now accusing her of trying to completely rewrite history, showing her lack of knowledge about global affairs, and basically revealing to the entire world that she's nothing more than a total ignoramus. In particular, they point to her bumbling and virtually incoherent response when she was asked whether or not the U.S. should commit military troops to defend Taiwan in the event of a Chinese invasion, with one critic saying that her jumbled and cliché-filled answer ultimately amounts to nothing more than a pile of ludicrous word salad, with gobs and gobs of Roquefort dressing. In the meantime, a number of other people also calling out AOC's apparent ignorance when it comes to her lack of basic elementary school level geography concerning the location of Venezuela, which, by the way, is right over there, which she wrongly claimed was south of the equator. By contrast, while the Congresswoman and her fellow Democrats were busy showing the entire planet that they're not yet ready for prime time, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, good guy, I like that guy, he's receiving rave reviews for his Munich speech. He received a standing ovation after reminding our European allies of our shared history and reassuring them that our long-standing partnership is far from over. So for her part, squad member AOC standing firmly behind her performance at the conference. She claims her audience in Munich was nothing more than a bunch of global elitists who don't give a hoot about her class-based message, that she went there to sound the alarm about the ties between economic inequality and far-right populism, and that it's far too soon for her to reveal whether or not she's planning to make a run at the White House in 2028. Final thoughts, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown, and here's the way I see it. I'll begin with, instead of calling future President AOC a train wreck, in my estimation, it would be far more appropriate to call actual train wrecks AOCs. On second thought, they're both sort of kind of interchangeable, so I'm going to pass on that one. But before moving on, here is the first ever recorded footage of what we call an AOC. Editor Pranov, roll tape, please. That's an actual AOC. In my mind, that's absolutely amazing. Now, I don't do it often, but just this once, I'm going to defend Congresswoman Trainwreck's utterance regarding Venezuela being south of the border. Look, if a big boat or maybe a rogue wave hit the very northern tip of Venezuela, it could push the entire continent south, and then they would, in fact, be below the equator. So maybe that's what she meant to say. Yeah, it makes sense to me. By the way, when recently queried about the potential for anything like that to happen, here's what she had to say. And Editor Pranov, if you would please, I believe this would be cut number 12.
I think that this is such I think that this is a this is, of course, a very longstanding policy of the United States.
And that's exactly what I was thinking. Hey, look, I know a great deal of people across the country have a lot to say about New York Representative Big Al, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But instead of criticizing her, vilifying her, and constantly mocking her, I say give her a break. She has a number of things to say, and provided she says them in a padded room under the direct supervision of medical professionals, I say she ought to be able to speak her mind and allow the whole world to be graced by her enormously cogent thoughts. AOC, so you know, I'm on your team. A pivot now, turn our attention to a troubling new issue which is brewing in Minnesota. Where else? Concerning Democrats. Who else? The Walz administration and a potential cover-up related to election integrity. That's a head-scratcher. Conflict in Minnesota. You gotta be kidding. That never happens. A dubious lawmaker in the land of 10,000 lakes now calling into question the integrity of her state's current voter registration records. And furthermore, she's claiming that the Democrat in charge is intentionally blocking her efforts to examine that information for herself. Well, if you're not hiding something, are you? The lawmaker says that after consulting with a bunch of election integrity groups, she unsuccessfully tried to get her hands on the active voter roll data from a handful of Minnesota counties. Additionally, she now claims that the Democrat in charge of those records, Minnesota Secretary of State, a guy called Steve Simon, he purposely tried to block all of her attempts to look at the relevant data by specifically ordering those counties to reject her request outright. However, he goes on to say that the largest county in the state actually came through in the clutch by providing her with the critical information, and that as a result, she's now found thousands of highly questionable active voters who are currently eligible to participate in future elections. I wonder if that means people who may have died back in 1978. Among the missing and potentially fraudulent data she's unearthed, incorrect addresses, names, and even birth dates, with some voters reportedly listed as well over 100 years old. Imagine that. For their part, county officials claim they routinely flag any voter records whenever they suspect foul play, especially an incorrect address. They also say they're simply adhering to state law and that in the end they run their elections in full partnership with the Secretary of State's office. Final thoughts. This is the news roundup lowdown, and this is, in my mind, the very bottom line. You know, we're a divergent bunch, and we all see the world through a different lens, and that's pretty much okay. But for me personally, when I think of Minnesota, my mind automatically turns to thousands and thousands of gorgeous lakes, including that real little one, the small one that people go rowboating on. The Lake Superior, I think is the name of that one. When I think of Minnesota, I think of hunting, fishing, and maybe even woofing down some good old state fair foods like deep-fried candy bars and cheese curds and all kinds of junk on a stick. That's good living. The last thing that crosses my mind when I think of Minnesota, anything that even remotely resembles unlawful activity at either the local, regional, or state level. Therefore, I got to tell you, when I first heard rumors surrounding the potential for voter fraud in America's 50th favorite state, I was utterly gobsmacked. Now, I got to be honest, I don't know a great deal about politics, but if in fact there's even a remote possibility of election improprieties in Minnesota, a state, by the way, which AOC also claims is like Venezuela, south of the equator, then I can almost guarantee that state leadership will address any and all issues in a timely manner, deal with the allegations appropriately, and be forthcoming and cooperative with federal officials every step of the way. Look, it's Minnesota, man, and those guys are always on the up and up. Now, part of my job as your News Roundup host is to assure each and every American that Minnesota is a great American state run by flag-saluting, immigration-enforcing, law-abiding politicians, I think. All right, switch things up just a bit and take a closer look at how former President Joe Biden and his cronies took painstaking efforts to virtually grant unlimited amnesty to nearly 1 million illegal immigrants, thus allowing them to stay here in our country indefinitely. According to a new report, in addition to the up to 10 million illegal immigrants which they reportedly allowed to enter our country, the former Biden administration also concocted a plan by which their Justice Department would intentionally terminate, dismiss, and simply toss out hundreds of thousands of cases before they ever reach the most critical hearing stage of the immigration process. The report claims that Biden's Homeland Security Secretary, Alejandro Mayorkas, you know him well, you remember him fondly, he relied on a little-known gimmick called Executive Office for Immigration Review in order to bring all those cases to a close simply by using their own discretion as federal prosecutors. The system is rigged. As a result, the staggering number of illegal immigrants were set loose on our streets and allowed to stay in the U.S. indefinitely, all without suffering any consequences for their actions whatsoever. The report goes on to explain that, in a nutshell, during the Biden years, whenever an immigration officer filed charges against an alleged alien, a legal alien that is, rather than prosecuting those cases, lawyers for the Department of Homeland Security instead simply wound up dropping them altogether. Ain't that convenient? In the meantime, while the Biden administration claims they were only temporarily pausing the removal hearings for those immigrants, in reality, the amount of time that those cases are actually postponed before they're eventually concluded averages nearly 3 decades, and that the aliens are living here among us the entire time. And let that sink in. Furthermore, critics now claim that the Biden administration intentionally hid their general amnesty plan from the American public by thoroughly manipulating our nation's immigration courts in a manner which cloaked their activities. They also say they left behind the entire mess for the Trump administration to clean up, and that even if ICE were to track down each and every one of these illegal immigrants, they'd be forced to go back to the beginning of the entire process when it comes to taking them to court and ultimately kicking them out of the country. Final thoughts, and this is the News Roundup Lowdown. There's a little something in the world called fair play, and honestly, if nothing else, I demand fairness in all stories presented right here on the world-famous News Roundup. Therefore, is it truly accurate to say that former President Joe Biden allowed millions of illegal aliens to walk across the border during his term, while also granting a quiet amnesty to nearly 1 million illegal aliens? No, it's not. And good old Joe is far from the only star in this nation-destroying story. And if you think about it, perhaps he actually had some help. Yeah, an accomplice. In other words, you got to give credit where credit is due. During his pretend presidency, Joe Biden had a substantial partner in crime who went by the name of Cacklin Kamala Harris. You may recall that Miss Laughs-A-Lot was a key player in unlocking the border doors, letting virtually everyone come on over, come on down. Then she and the chief left an enormous mess, as we just said, for the subsequent administration, the current one, to clean up.
We did it. We did it, Joe.
Now, while all this was happening, the boss was playing Candy Crush on the White House cell phone, and she was plotting her failed ascension to Pennsylvania Avenue. Didn't pan out too well, did it? She spent her days and nights laughing hysterically at everything, even that thing, the moon. But unfortunately, it's nearly impossible to find any footage of her chortling. I'd ask Editor Pranoff for a clip, but there's no way to find one anywhere on the internet.
Yeah, I did that. Uh-huh.
He found one. That was absolutely amazing. Fast forward to right now, when you hear war stories about the Trump administration securing the border, restoring law and order, finding, arresting, and deporting illegal aliens, don't beat up on the border czar Tom Homan, 47, or VP Vance. Instead, thank the previous administration for doing everything in their power at that time to compromise the safety, security, and well-being of each and every American, folks like you and I, by failing in their constitutional duties to secure the border, and all for their own personal and political gain. And as we always say, well done. Now, some alarming news to share with you concerning the accelerated military buildup of our nation's leading foreign adversary. According to a new report, Communist China has been drastically ramping up their production of nuclear-powered submarines, and they're now rapidly approaching a point where they could soon challenge our nation's long-standing and unquestioned military might on the high seas. The report comes from a military think tank called the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and it warns that the communist regime's naval force already includes at least a dozen nuclear subs as part of their growing arsenal, with many of them armed with ballistic missiles. Really think about that. It's a big deal. They point out that right now the U.S. still holds a sizable advantage over China concerning submarines, especially when it comes to the nuclear-powered variety. The think tank also says that moving forward, we're in extreme danger of losing that advantage because each and every year, the U.S. Navy is falling further behind the communist regime when it comes to churning out new submarines. But that, thankfully, those brand new Chinese-made subs are still light years behind the West when it comes to quality. Always buy American. Now, some additional headlines we're also keeping a very close watch on right here in the News Roundup newsroom because we want you to take on the day well informed. First off, in the Big Apple, New York City Mayor Zoran Mamdani, we call him Mamkami, is reportedly considering a new plan to add more than $1 billion to city coffers by increasing the number and the cost of local parking meters, with angry residents calling the move a blatant and ridiculous cash grab. Yeah, stick your debit card into the little meter machine, spend $8 for every 15 minutes, and enjoy your night out on the town. Thank you, Mayor Mamkami. Moving along to Washington, where speculation running rampant that President Trump may soon get the opportunity to name a fourth conservative justice to the Supreme Court, as current Justice Samuel Alito is reportedly preparing to step down while Republicans are still in firm control of the Senate. One we're watching very carefully. And in a bit of sad news, iconic civil rights leader Jesse Jackson has just passed away at the age of 84. President Trump paying his respects by offering his deepest sympathies and condolences to Jackson's family, adding that he knew the Reverend for decades, that he was a good man as well, and that he was someone who truly loved everybody. And now a quick gander at a bit of showbiz news. Then we kick things off today with a kick in the pants for a rising Hollywood heartthrob, a guy called Jacob Elordi. Never heard of Jacob Elordi, but he's the next big thing, apparently. According to reports, the Oscar-nominated Frankenstein star's latest head-turning role as Heathcliff in the steamy remake of Wuthering Heights may still not be enough to score him the highly coveted role of super spy James Bond. Insiders say that because her husband, Jeff Bezos, now owns all the rights to the lucrative franchise, Lauren Sanchez now gets final approval over all things 007, and that right now she's just not kind of feeling it when it comes to casting Elordi in that part. I guess the moral of the story is that to become a big-time, high-paid casting director for a Hollywood, California blockbuster movie show, you should first be a TV reporter for a news station here in Los Angeles. Yeah, that's what she used to do. Suppose it doesn't hurt that Miss Sanchez is related to the guy who owns the company that owns the rights to the James Bond franchise, but the way I see it, merely a coincidence. There's no nepotism at Amazon, and that policy is clearly spelled out, to my understanding, on page 943 in the Human Resources Manual. There's also this, in my humble estimation, I think I'd be a perfect James Bond. Hey, Lauren Sanchez, don't forget about your News Roundup host for that new flick. I've always wanted to be a movie star. And moving along now to some disturbing news concerning extreme filth at the happiest place on earth. In the latest scandal to hit the Magic Kingdom, thousands of visitors at Walt Disney World in Florida, they say they were recently exposed to a bunch of extremely disgusting and potentially harmful black mold while riding the theme park's popular It's a Small World attraction. After catching wind of the problem, the team at Disney apparently wound up giving the entire ride a good scrubbing. Break out those SOS pads. And according to fans, now safe for American families to enjoy the ride once again. My mind, mold, schmold. Long time ago, I saw some of the green junk on a chunk of cheese. I cut that part out and had a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch. No problem. I saw some mold on an orange. I threw it away and ate an apple. Also, I'm no doctor, but I've heard that penicillium mold naturally produces the antibiotic penicillin. And maybe it's just some goofy rumor, but they say penicillin will cure what ails you. In any event, if this Disney World Florida small world thingy frightens you, you can simply drive on over to one of the other Disney parks. Tokyo Disney Resort in Japan, Disneyland Paris over in France, Hong Kong Disneyland Resort, and or Shanghai Disney Resort in China. I'm just saying, look, you got options. And with that, this ride is over. Time to call it a wrap on the big news roundup. So have an awesome day today. We're about halfway through the week. Stay safe. And if you haven't done so already, it's right there. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. With that, we're going to dim the lights, also fade to black. And we'll see you right back here next time for another episode of the Big News Roundup.